Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. We have multiple areas of severe weather on tap for today, and perhaps significant severe weather. And the first area, this enhanced risk down here in north and central Texas, including places like Abilene down to Waco. This is an area you don't normally see under the gun for severe weather in this part of June. But we do have a very potent setup on tap for that area. This is going to be an all hazards threat. I'll zoom in a little bit here to give you a little bit better look at who's in and who's out. Abilene down to Waco and areas in between. Fairly small enhanced risk, surrounded by a large slight risk up to the Red River region in that North Texas, Oklahoma region. Second area of concern today is going to be up here in southeast Colorado. Slight risk, level 2 out of 5, up here from basically Pueblo southeast into the western Oklahoma panhandle, northeast New Mexico. That is a different kind of setup from what we have going on down here in Texas, but still potent nonetheless. Let's show you the hazards for today. All hazards on tap in both regimes. The greatest tornado threat is going to be associated with the enhanced risk in Texas. We do have a 5% severe tornado threat down there across Texas, surrounded by a 2%, and a separate area of 2% from that southeast Colorado corridor down into northeast New Mexico and the western panhandles. Large hail going to be a concern as well, perhaps significant hail, 30% hatched area down there in the enhanced risk in Texas with a 15 hatch surrounding that. So the potential for some pretty big hailstones is in play for the central Texas region. That does include the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. You are in the 15% hatched area for severe hail today. So keep an eye out for some large stones today. For the northern mode, 15% hatched as well. Large hail going to be the main risk up there. Damaging winds going to be a threat, particularly down in that Texas threat, 15% hatched there for some significant wind gusts. All right, let's go ahead and dive right in. This is our water vapor satellite imagery, and it looks a little bit different from what we saw a couple days ago. We do see this swirl out here across the desert southwest, Great Basin region. This is finally going to make its way, make some decent progress eastward into the southern and central plains today. We've been talking about how this pattern recently has been dominated by what we call an omega block. Basically, we have a ridge of high pressure stuck in between two troughs. We've had a trough out here off the northeast coast and a trough out here on the west coast for some time. This west coast trough finally making its way inland an appreciable distance, breaking down this ridge as we go through the day today into tomorrow, and that's what's going to drive our severe threat over the next couple of days, particularly today into tomorrow. Now we do have a little bit of a swirl up in here. This is an upper low as well that has shifted off. We had this very large long wave trough up here across the northeast coast. Part of that has shifted off, and a separate little trough has started to dig down here into the Great Lakes region. This will also act to suppress the ongoing ridge and really get this omega block that's been very stubborn throughout this May into early June out of here. So again, we're going to have this trough off the west coast going to be our main player, but we'll have multiple factors that are going to be suppressing this ridge and going to get that omega block out of here for a more robust threat for severe storms over the next few days. Now let's take a look at what's going on now. You see this complex of storms here across Oklahoma. This is an ongoing complex of strong to severe storms. We had a severe storm roll through Norman, where I live this morning. Got some large hail out of that, some $1.25 to $half size hail out of that. We've had multiple hail reports here across the region as well. Some damaging wind gusts with these storms. These are moving quickly off to the southeast, and they will not be a huge factor for today's threat in both regions. I do wonder what effect this will have on the overall positioning of the frontal zone. We'll talk about the overall surface pattern here in just a second, but we will have a frontal zone set up somewhere in here across the north to central Texas corridor ahead of a dry line. If we see a renewed development here on the backside of these storms, that could help to push this frontal zone a little bit farther south and perhaps allow it to attain some southward movement throughout the day. We usually like to see these frontal boundaries or any boundaries in play that will aid in the severe weather threat for a setup. We like to see them, at least from a chasing perspective, to be stationary. And I do wonder, we are seeing a little bit more convection here on the backside, and some of the models are predicting some more storms here in Oklahoma on the backside of this ongoing complex going into the late morning into the early afternoon hours. I do wonder what impacts that will have on the frontal zone, but overall, we still should be seeing a robust severe threat down here in northern to central Texas today. We also see some convection up here across southeast Colorado. That has been forecast by a lot of the models here going into today. It is not quite as widespread as was expected. Some of the models were showing quite a bit of convection out here in southeast Colorado this morning, which was going to have implications on destabilization out there. Still could have quite a few impacts on destabilization, may make the corridor of best destabilization a little bit narrower, but if these move out of here nicely, and it looks like they are moving off to the north and northeast away from the kind of I-25 corridor there in Colorado near Pueblo, that shouldn't be too much of an issue, but we'll have to watch that for sure. So lots of storms ongoing this morning, lots of perturbations in this large-scale flow, and we'll see that on the 500 millibar map. We see kind of the remnants of this omega block here across the plains. We still have this ridge of high pressure in place. Trough situated out here across the Great Basin to southwest vicinity with some stronger flow rounding the base of that trough, finally impinging into the southern plains. Big old trough, big old closed low up here across the Michigan-Wisconsin area. That is going to have some impacts on suppressing the ridge, as we said. This is not going to suppress the ridge super quickly, however. We're going to see a little bit of ridging take shape, or at least remain in place across the southern plains here going into today. We're not going to see those strong height falls that we like to see. And by height falls, basically you're looking at these black contours here. These are called geopotential height contours. Basically, it's the height of the 500 millibar constant pressure surface above sea level. So for example, this height contour right here is 5,760 meters above sea level. That's the surface, where the distance of the 500 millibar pressure surface above sea level at these locations. And for a given setup, oftentimes with a big old trough setup we often see in the springtime, you'll see these troughs progress eastward pretty nicely. And if you have a location, let's say right in here, for example, right in here, and you have a trough that's passing by. Later on in the afternoon, you'll probably see something like this. So you'll have what was this contour here moved to here, and you'll have height falls at this location. The geopotential height is falling at that particular location. We like to see those height falls as that directly associates with rising motion and the ingredients we like to see for severe weather. That's not going to be much of the case today, especially across the southern target, where we will see a little bit of this ridging maintain itself, albeit at a very low amplitude as this trough starts to move in. And by evening time, we should see the more impacts from this trough as it makes its way into the West Texas and Central Texas vicinity for a little bit more oomph into the atmosphere. Mostly today, we should be relying on these surface features to initiate storms, as well as the strong surface heating that is expected to take place here to get storms going in both of these regimes, especially the southern regime. Northern regime, very much upslope flow, closer proximity to this trough. That will help initiate storms across the region. That is what is helping to initiate these storms right now across southeast Colorado, and will continue to initiate storms along that I-25 corridor there in central Colorado. Now, we still don't have that super strong trough that's traversing the Rockies, so we would not expect to see a super strong low-level response. Here's our low-level jet right now. You see this broad cyclone here across the western half of the country. Not really a tightly wound low-level cyclone to really ramp up that low-level jet. So the low-level winds are going to remain somewhat on the weaker side here, but we should have a fairly nice surface pattern to allow for at least some turning of these winds with height. We do have about 15, 20, 25 knots here across Texas, out of the due south pretty much, and we will have winds at the surface more out of the east or southeast here ahead of the warm front dry line intersection. We'll talk about that in just a second. So we will have some veering of those winds in the low levels with height, given also a westerly component to the 500 millibar winds. We have strong deep layer wind shear in place for supercells. The low level wind shear once again is a little bit on the weaker side, given we don't have a strong low level response here, but we should have enough turning in the low levels for at least some tornado threat, especially along any boundaries, any surface boundaries, the warm front in particular here across the southern mode. Same thing, kind of the same thing here in the Colorado target. We have what we call an upslope flow regime. Surface winds are more out of the east here. Let me just go to the surface map right now. So you see that in spades here. Weakish surface low here across West Texas. That is expected to perhaps migrate east a little bit today. Perhaps stay put, migrate just slightly east today, with the warm front here draped across central Texas. Easterly winds to the north of that, southerly winds to the south of that boundary. And again, wherever that warm front sets up is going to be the key for today. But you see, if we have those winds here right along the front, more out of the east or southeast, if you have that juxtaposed with a low-level jet that is weak, but albeit out of the south, we do have some low-level shear that is favorable for tornadoes there, especially along that frontal boundary. Now in Colorado, same thing here. We have what looks to be a ridge of high pressure here across the plains, that clockwise flow here centered across Nebraska. So that is creating southeasterly flow, or easterly or southeasterly flow. You hear a little bit of thunder outside right now here in Norman. A little bit of easterly or southeasterly flow here across southeast Colorado. That's what we call upslope flow. It's going up that higher terrain, and that is favorable for increasing a little bit of lift across that region and making that low-level shear profile favorable for perhaps a tornadic supercell or two out here, pending destabilization. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. But let's go look at our surface data here. So this is the surface data. We'll start here with the southern sector. We'll move north in just a second. So you can pick out the surface features pretty easily. Here we have our surface low. Looks to be centered somewhere in there. You see that counterclockwise curvature there, centered somewhere just to the north of Pecos, Texas, right in there. Whoops, shouldn't have drawn that H there. That is supposed to be a low pressure area right there. My bad. So low pressure area right there, warm front clearly draped somewhere in this vicinity right now. You see what we were talking about just a second ago, more easterly winds on the north side of the boundary, southerly winds to the south of the boundary. The warm front perhaps expected to lift northward just a little bit today, but again, the ongoing storms across the Red River region may temper that just a little bit. We'll have to watch how much convection develops on the backside of the ongoing complex. As if we have a lot more strong convection here to the north side, that could push out some outflow and keep that warm front a little bit farther south. If we don't have as much convection, that ongoing convection gets out of here pretty quickly, and not much renewed convection on the backside, then that will allow this warm front to lift northward just a little bit into the day. Very juicy air mass here. You can see the dew points, those green values here. North of the front, still in the mid to upper 60s. South of the front, extremely, extremely juicy. Dew points in the low to mid 70s even. We have a 76 dew point right here. Low 70s here across the region. So very juicy air mass south of the warm front. It's going to be a sauna out there today with temperatures warming into perhaps the mid 90s today across this region. So very favorable looking surface pattern for a supercell threat today with a lot of moisture in place. There will be a dry line that is expected to take shape. Here's our warm front once again. Dry line, it will be expected to take shape. It's all the way back here in New Mexico and West Texas right now. You see dew points there in West Texas in the 30s and 40s, 60s dew points to the east of that. So our dry line is somewhere in here. That is going to shift eastward today, and that will develop what we call a triple point, that intersection between the dry line and the warm front, which will be our favored location where lift and convergence is maximized, and that will be our favored location for storm initiation right along that dry line warm front intersection or triple point. Let's go up a little bit further to our northern sector here. And we see a pretty favorable look here as well. So we have easterly winds, that upslope flow across southeast Colorado, those winds going up the higher terrain there. That, as we know, if we have wind that is going toward a higher terrain feature, it can't go into it, so it's got to go somewhere, and that place is up. So that's why we get a little bit more lift when we have this upslope flow in place. Very high dew points for Colorado's standards here. We have almost 60s dew points here in that corridor from Pueblo southeastward, so that is extremely favorable. Extremely favorable look here. We've talked about this a lot of times before on the channel. When you have a higher terrain area, the air in that higher terrain can't hold as much moisture. So a dew point of 59 here in this higher terrain, that's really like a 70-degree dew point here out across the lower plains here of maybe Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. So that is extremely, extremely favorable. An extremely favorable look at the surface for a severe threat across Colorado today. You don't see 60s dew points a lot here in Colorado. When that does happen with this upslope flow, we always have to be on alert for some tornadic supercells across that region. Let's look at some soundings. 12Z soundings are in. We'll start here with our southern sector. This is Dallas-Fort Worth. 12Z sounding, so 7 a.m. Central Daylight Time. Instability already in place here. We do see 74 over 68 at the surface. Just north of the warm front, you see that northeasterly wind at the surface. So we are north of the warm front here. Still fairly accurate for what we need to, for what the environment is going to be south of that front. But we see decent moist layer here extending up into the atmosphere. Not super dry air there in the low levels. That will help things out today. Very steep lapse rates aloft though as well. You see that steep lapse rate layer there. That, as we always talk about, is our elevated mixed layer, or EML. That EML is that layer of warm, dry, well-mixed air that it initiates on the higher terrain in the desert southwest and western Mexico and gets transported eastward out atop that moist layer in the plains, helps allow storms to remain at bay throughout much of the day until that cap is broken, and also allows instability to build. And we're going to see instability in spades here with this southern setup. Already quite a bit of instability in place. Mixed layer cape only 500, surface-based cape about 1,000 atop this capping inversion here. But that is expected to grow. Quite a bit of sunshine expected to the south of the ongoing storm complex today. Let me shift south here. You see quite a bit of sunshine here. Some of these low clouds, low thick clouds here across the region. That shouldn't be too much of an issue. One thing to note here, you do see these ripples here out across North Texas. That is some gravity wave action from this ongoing complex. And again, if these continue to produce outflow, that may shunt the front southward just a little bit. But we'll have to watch that, as we said. So instability in place already. Photographs at this point. We already have effective shear of 50 knots. That was what was plaguing our setup a couple days ago across central Texas, north central Texas, was the lack of deep layer shear. It started off fairly weak and didn't really increase all that much into the afternoon hours, only about 30, 35 knots or so. We already have bulk shear values at 50 knots, much longer photographs than the other day. So that is going to be much more favorable for supercells and the maintenance of supercells today across this region. Low level shear, again, going to be on the weak side, weak low level flow, but it is veering low level flow. So there should be at least some turning to these photographs. We'll take a look at some model photographs here in a second. I want to take one from farther south in the warm sector. See a little bit shallower of a moist layer there, 81/78 here at Corpus Christi. Again, this is a little bit farther south. I wish we had a sounding here from maybe Austin or San Antonio, but we don't have that right now. Some very dry, warm air associated with the elevated mixed layer down there, and already a good bit of surface-based instability at this point across this area. So we should have a very juicy looking air mass, deep layer shear favorable for supercells. Let's take a look here farther north. This is Dodge City right now. So this is the closest we can get to our southeast Colorado target. We'll look at Dodge City and Amarillo. Not much instability to speak of right now, but we do have that upslope flow in the low levels. Long photographs already here, 36 to about 40 knots or so of that deep layer shear that we like to see. Longer photographs here. Not much curvature yet in the low levels, but that should change going into the day today as we move into southeast Colorado a little bit. But you see that 61/58 there. 58-degree dew point is very high for this region. Here's Amarillo. Much of the same, that strong upslope flow there, easterly flow in the low levels. Deep moisture, that is a very good sign if you're looking for some strong supercells here in southeast Colorado today. Very deep moisture beneath that slight elevated mixed layer there should be able to allow for some supercells to fire up there in Colorado, pending the coverage of storms today. Again, we don't want to see, if you're chasing out there today, you don't want to see a lot of storms fire in southeast Colorado. That may sap the instability just a bit going into today or this afternoon. Let's take a look at some model data here. This is the 12Z NAM run. Let me actually pull up the 12Z run. This is the 6Z. Here is the 12Z NAM. Here's at 500 millibars, about 18,000 feet. And we can see it's initialized our upper level pattern pretty well. Strong trough, closed low here out across the Great Basin, desert southwest vicinity. Stronger flow rounding the base of that trough. Our ridge is still in place there across the southern plains with our closed low up here in the Great Lakes region. So still somewhat of that omega block look to it, but again, you'll see how that breaks down going into the afternoon today. This is going to be at 0Z, 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time here out across the southern plains. You see that stronger flow starting to impinge into the West Texas, Central Texas vicinity there, and that ridge has definitely lost some of its amplitude going back to 12Z. You see it's a little bit higher amplitude there that is suppressed quite a bit by both this feature here, this kind of retrograding closed low up here in the Great Lakes, and this trough moving in across the south. You'll notice those height falls don't exactly occur like we'd like to see. So we have what we call neutral heights here across this region. And keep your eye focused here in central Texas, north central Texas there. We don't really see height falls across that region. We don't see these contours really crossing that area from west to east, indicating height falls. But that's not going to be too much of an issue, as we'll have, again, strong surface heating, strong surface pattern, strong convergence at the surface along that triple point to allow storm formation there in north central to central Texas today. We have more of a glancing blow up here from this trough across Colorado, but still a much closer vantage point to that trough here. You see it, that nice little shortwave there embedded in the flow. Rounds into that region into the late afternoon hours. This is going to be at 3 p.m. Mountain Time there, UTC -6 there, so 3 p.m. Mountain Time there in Colorado. We have that shortwave moving through, timed pretty well with the diurnal cycle. Should get some heating there on the mountains. Storms will initially fire along the mountains there, the higher terrain, and then eventually move off into the lower elevations there near Pueblo and areas southeast. So, interesting look here, especially interesting for June. Don't often see this strong flow here in the southern plains. Usually we've migrated our severe threat up north, Colorado, northern Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, the Dakotas. Not the case here. This is definitely a little bit abnormal for this time of year. Let's go down to 850 millibars, and we'll see that we aren't going to have that strong low-level response here throughout the day. We still have a little bit of low-level jet in place, 20 knots or so across the central Texas vicinity. That may be just enough to get some nice curvature in those photographs, along with that directional shear in the low levels for that supercell and perhaps tornado threat down there today. Up into Colorado, a little bit of the same, 15, 20 knots there, but it is out of the southeast. With those more easterly winds at the surface, some nice veering of those low-level winds with height there out across southeast Colorado. Let's look at our surface pattern a little bit closely here. We'll start with the southern plains sector. So here's our weak-ish surface low down here in West Texas. Again, that's just going to kind of sit there throughout the day and broaden out just a little bit, but we will have that warm frontal zone located somewhere here in the north central to central Texas vicinity out ahead of that weak surface low there and ahead of the dry line. The dry line is going to be critical here as well. You see that dry line very tight already, but still well out to the west, and our warm front draped somewhere in here. Let's go ahead and advance it a little bit. You see that dry line mixes east a little bit. This is at 21Z, so 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Here's your dry line. Here's your warm front. Right at that triple point will be our favored location for storm initiation in this southern mode. Now, the NAM here is pretty far west. Here is Abilene right in there. This is pretty far west for this triple point. Most of the models have it a little bit farther east, probably somewhere in here, but we'll have to just watch where that dryline triple point, dryline warm front intersection or triple point sets up. The NAM has it here almost back south of the Lubbock area there, which is a little bit far west. And again, we'll have to watch the northward advance of this warm front with time. If we get continued convection up here, that may suppress it a little bit. We'll just have to wait and see how that plays out. But again, pretty clear where to be if you're chasing here in the southern mode today. It's going to be that triple point area where that dry line meets the warm front. And then eventually that warm front will sag through going into the afternoon or evening hours. And the severe threat will pretty much end going into the overnight hours. We do have some forcing here to keep those storms going into central Texas, maybe southeast Texas, going into the evening to nighttime hours today. But the main severe threat will come in the first several hours of initiation as those storms move southeast into central Texas. Let's take a look at some soundings here before we move to our northern mode. We'll take one here at 21Z, just ahead of the triple point there near Abilene. And we'll show you the environment here. So this is going to be at 21Z, 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. So here's our initial environment. NAM has a little bit of capping in place here. 82 degrees is going to be much too cool at the surface. I can already tell you that. Temperature is expected to warm into the 90s. That will erode that cap very efficiently. But the overall story here is pretty good. Mixed layer CAPE over 4,000 joules per kilogram. That is extreme instability here. You see all that area between the parcel trace, the blue dashed line, and the red line here. That temperature profile should go up in the atmosphere. So ample instability, perhaps even greater than this if we reach those low to mid 90s temperatures there across that region. Dew points there very high, 73 degree dew point there at the surface. Fairly deep moist layer there up above 850 millibars. That is a very strong thermodynamic profile for supercells for explosive convection here today. Photographs there a little bit on the lacking side here, at least on the NAM run. Low level shear, as we said, going to be on the weaker side. Only effective SRH here, only about 90 meters squared per second squared. That's a little bit lower than what we usually see with your classic tornado events, but we do see a little bit of curvature there in those low levels with a strong long photograph, deep layer shear up almost 60 knots there. So strong deep layer shear for supercells for sure. just the tornado threat may not maximize until going into the evening hours or any supercell that can ride it exactly along that frontal boundary, that warm frontal boundary today. Let's go to 0Z here, take a sounding out ahead of that triple point as well. By this time, storms should have fired. Storms are going to fire probably mid to late afternoon or so. This is going to be at 0Z. You see instability here at 5,400 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE there. That is extreme. And we talked about this in the last video. The large hail threat definitely going to be there today, but when you have this much instability, that can almost be too much of a good thing. I didn't really explain why in the last video, but you can see here extreme instability, 5,400 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE. When you have instability this strong, that means your updraft speeds, the velocity of your upward motion in the updrafts, it's going to be extremely fast. The convection is going to be very explosive. That can sometimes allow hailstones to get chucked out of the updraft, out of that optimal hail growth zone too quickly. In other words, you can have these small hailstones that go through the updraft, the hail growth zone, but they get chucked out pretty quickly because of those super strong updraft speeds. As a result, you'll see a lot of small hail on these days and not a lot of large hail reports. We can still get very large hail here in these environments. We have large instability and weaker low-level shear. So that is a combination we like to see for large hail, but because we have so much instability, that could mean we won't see those baseball, softball-sized hail reports that you might expect with a situation like this because of those super strong updraft speeds, kicking those hailstones out of the optimal hail growth zone too quickly before they can attain a robust size. But going back to our overall profile here at 0Z, strong instability. That cap has eroded pretty nicely there. Again, 88 might be a little bit too cool. Dew points in the low 70s. That may be also another thing as well. If we get temperatures into the mid-90s there, 94, 95 degrees, dew points, the NAM doesn't like to mix as much as it probably should, so maybe dew points in the low 70s, 95 over 72 there, maybe roughly. That's a 23-degree temperature dew point spread there, and we've talked about this ad nauseum before. Your rule of thumb usually is about 20 degrees between those two values. So we may see these supercells be a little bit more high-based. We'll just have to watch those surface temperatures. If they get into that low to mid-90s range, dew points drop off a little bit into the low 70s. We may start getting close to that 20-degree threshold. And storms may be a little bit more on the high-based side. High-based means they may be have a greater tendency to produce more outflow and perhaps undercut any mesocyclones that try to develop with these storms. If we decipher our hodograph a little bit more, once again, weaker low-level shear here. Let me take one right along that boundary just to show you exactly the look here. If any storms that can ride the boundary, they will have probably a larger hodograph than this, and you can see exactly what we're talking about there. Still, very strong instability along that boundary, but a much more looped hodograph there in the low level, stronger veering of those winds, given more easterly winds right along and north of that boundary. So if any storm can ride that warm frontal boundary, there will be a threat for a tornado or two, perhaps a conditional threat for a strong tornado or two, given such strong instability with this much low-level shear right along that warm front. Could be a strong tornado threat there. Any storms that deviate from the boundary, you will see an environment more like this. Weaker low-level shear in the open warm sector with strong instability would favor more of a large hail threat, perhaps, and damaging wind threat than a significant tornado threat. But we'll have to watch that for sure, as any storms riding along that warm front may have a tornado threat. We'll have the greatest tornado threat in this southern regime. Fairly discrete mode expected as well. If you look at our dry line and our warm front there, dry lines, basically our dry lines, your initiating boundary. Let's look at our shear vectors with respect to the boundary. They're very much perpendicular to that boundary, so a discrete storm mode is going to be most likely today. Just a couple of supercells giving weak forcing aloft, but strong lift on that triple point. We'll probably see one or two supercells fire there, moving off to the southeast as they turn right, and then they will be able to realize that strong kinematic and thermodynamic environment here in the southern regime. Let's go to our northern regime here. Let me move up here. We'll move to our floater sector. They have a nice floater sector out for us. Once again, we saw that shortwave trough moving through at 500 millibars throughout the day. Very nicely timed there. A little bit of a kink in the height contours here at 500 millibars. This is at 3 p.m. there. Very nicely timed here to get storm initiation to go. Again, the higher terrain, given that upslope flow, storms will fire on that higher terrain just along and west of I-25 before they move off into the lower elevations here this afternoon. 850 millibars we saw, not all that strong. Let's look at our surface pattern up here. and you see that surface high pressure area, that clockwise flow around that surface high there, still allowing some upslope flow there at the surface. And again, we're much more relying on terrain features out here in this area for our severe threat to get storms going. But you see strong looking dew points there across the region, upper 50s dew points here. That's like an upper 60s dew point out here in the lower elevations of the plains. So we'll start here. Let's go right in here. We'll take one at Pueblo there at 3 p.m. And we'll also take one down here a little bit farther south east later on into the afternoon. So this is our setup here at Pueblo, 21Z, 3 p.m. Much more meager instability with the Colorado setup today. Again, we'll have to watch how much convection happens in southeast Colorado this morning to see how much impact it has on destabilization. But these wind profiles are pretty eye-opening, especially for Colorado standards. A lot of turning there in the lowest levels, lots of veering in those low-level winds. As you go up in the atmosphere there, 200 meters squared per second squared of effective storm relative helicity. And you don't need a lot of instability out here with the higher terrain. So I would expect a few supercells in this environment. This may be a little bit underdone as well. Perhaps we'll see closer to 1,000 joules per kilogram here of mixed layer CAPE, only 600 on this particular model run. 0Z, much of the same, a little bit of capping builds in. I think that's a NAM quirk. I wouldn't pay too much attention about that. That higher terrain out there will help overcome any lingering inhibition that tries to hang out there. But hodographs there, very favorable for supercells. Long hodographs there, deep layer shear, favorable for supercells, and some turning of those hodographs there in the lowest levels. Definitely favorable for a tornado or two with some large hail out there as well. Let's take a look at some convection allowing models here. We'll take a look at our 12Z run of the HRRR. Actually, let's see what our most recent run is in. So it's the 13Z run. So let's see what happens on the 13Z run here. You see all that convection across southern Oklahoma right now, initialized pretty well. It continues that into the afternoon here across the Red River with some embedded, perhaps elevated supercells in there. So again, we'll have to watch that. That may try to spit out some outflow here, try to push that warm front a little bit farther south, closer to maybe the I-20 corridor. If not, we may see a little bit farther north as well. We'll just have to wait and see for that. But you see, storms are going to fire first in that Colorado regime. You see some storms there in southeast Colorado going into the late morning hours, and always on these higher terrain events. The higher terrain is a great lifting mechanism, allows storms to fire a little bit earlier. This is at 18Z, so pretty much noon out there across just west of the I-25 corridor there in southeast Colorado. Some early supercells there, and they will eventually move off the higher terrain there east of I-25, Colorado Springs down to Pueblo there, and perhaps some additional development down here near the Breton Mesa as well. And then they will last into the evening there into southeast Colorado, the far western panhandles as well. Then stuff will fire down in the southern regime. This is 5 p.m. Central Daylight Time here. You see our first blips there out across along I-20, just west of Abilene, it looks like. And again, wherever that triple point sets up is where the initiation is going to be. Could be a little bit farther west, could be a little bit farther east. We'll just have to watch the OBS going into today to see how that plays out. And again, this may be a little bit late. I always subtract an hour or two off of this, so maybe 3 to 4 p.m. at the earliest here, storm initiation along that triple point there in north central Texas. And you can see given the explosive instability that's in place, they will very quickly, rapidly become severe. And you see very discrete storm mode here. Even one up here along the Red River, maybe slightly elevated there, but a couple of intense supercells there driving southeast into central Texas, lasting quite a while there. Again, they will have all hazards at play, especially any that ride along the warm front. If this fires on the triple point and deviates southeast, this may have more of a large hail threat. We may be looking at these closer to that warm front just to the north for a more robust tornado threat. So just keep that in mind if you're chasing out there today. We want to be close to that warm frontal boundary because it has the greatest low-level shear along it. Still, these will all be beastly supercells, perhaps some large hail. We'll have to watch and see how that large hail threat plays out given so much instability in place. But these will be very intense supercells today. And they will last quite a while, multiple supercells, perhaps impacting the DFW Metroplex going into the early evening hours as well. Large hail threat, damaging winds, perhaps a tornado or two there as well. So we'll have to watch that. Everybody in the DFW Metroplex needs to be on alert for today. And so this is a very robust look here on the HRRR. Let's look at a couple other models here just for giggles here. This is the WRF ARW. Keeps those storms going through the morning in Oklahoma. We get storm formation here. We'll look at the Texas threat, then shift northward here. This is about 23Z, 6 p.m. Storms fire there near the Abilene area, driving down toward the Brady-Brownwood area. Very intense supercells there with an all-hazards threat. Farther to the north here, you'll see storms fire much earlier along that higher terrain of east central Colorado, and then they drive southeastward there into the lower elevations. NSSL WRF model. We'll start here to the north with this time. A couple supercells here, a couple down here, more isolated here in northeast New Mexico. Could be a nice play there, but those wind profiles in southeast Colorado are very favorable look there for a tornado or two with some large hail there as well. We'll drop down south and look at the southern regime. So this model fires some more robust convection on the south side of the ongoing complex going into the afternoon. Again, that may have some implications on where that warm front sets up, but eventually we do have more supercells fired here closer to that warm frontal boundary into the warm sector there in central Texas going into the evening hours. Last model we'll look at here is the FV3. And the FV3, probably going to throw this one out. We don't see hardly any convection here ongoing here in Oklahoma. But I think the overall idea is pretty good, that we will have a couple intense supercells there along that triple point fire and dive down into central Texas today with an all-hazards threat, perhaps a significant all-hazards threat there in that regime. Up to the north, much of the same. We see some supercells fire early on that higher terrain there in southeast Colorado and then move off into the east with an all-hazards threat as well. So that's going to do it for this video. Once again, we have multiple areas that we're watching today. The first one, the most robust one, is going to be this enhanced risk area, this orange area here, level 3 out of 5 from Abilene down to Waco and areas in between. This could shift a little bit. We'll have to watch where that sets up. I think the NAM was maybe a little bit too far west, but somewhere in this vicinity here of the, just maybe east of the Lubbock-Midland corridor is where things may start to fire, closer to Abilene there. Storms will fire near that triple point, that warm front dry line intersection, and we'll have an all-hazards threat as they move off to the southeast into this enhanced risk area. Any storm that can ride along that warm front will have an enhanced tornado threat given stronger low-level shear along the boundary. Storms away from the boundary in the open warm sector will have mostly a large hail threat, although the large hail threat is up in the air given such strong instability in place. And we explained why that is the case, but large hail, damaging winds, and a tornado or two possible with any storms in the open warm sector. Again, we want to be hugging those boundaries for our greatest tornado threat today in that area. Dallas-Fort Worth, Metroplex, the entire Metroplex under the gun today for severe weather. You're not in the enhanced risk. You're in that yellow slight risk area, level 2 out of 5, but still need to be on alert for perhaps an all-hazards threat with supercells moving in late this afternoon and early evening. Second area of interest up here in southeast Colorado, areas near Pueblo, Colorado Springs, southeastward into the northeast New Mexico, western panhandles vicinity. All hazards on the table there as well. Storms will fire first on the higher terrain to the west of the I-25 corridor there, west of Pueblo. They will move then southeastward into an environment that is characterized by much weaker instability than farther south, but still adequate for this area. A very moist low-level air mass will be favorable for, and a looping hodograph will be favorable for perhaps a tornadic supercell or two with a large hail threat up in this slight risk area. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.